Morning, folks. It's wonderful to see everybody here live in person. Exciting, like the before times. My name is Matt Klein. I'm the Chief Program and Impact Officer here at Robinhood. And on behalf of our board, our CEO, Rich Buery, our whole staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our deep dive series. Child poverty, which is the focus of today's deep dive, is always a critical topic, but it's particularly important moment now to focus attention on it because we are living through and witnessing a period of dramatic change. As our speakers are going to discuss, we saw a dramatic and sharp decline in child poverty in 2021 to its lowest level in history. And that was driven in large part by the enhanced federal child tax credit, part of pandemic relief. But that federal child tax credit's enhancement has not been continued. And so just as we saw a dramatic drop, we're now seeing a dramatic spike in child poverty. So we are witnessing in real time a stark representation of the fact that child poverty truly is a policy choice. And that demands our attention. More than that, demands our efforts, not just to reinstate what was a successful policy at the federal level, but to make choices here in New York about how to put millions of children on the path to successful futures. So thank you for joining us this morning. I see many friends in the room, so I know most people here are already familiar with Robinhood and our work, but for those who are just getting to know us, let me share a little bit of background. Robinhood's mission is to elevate New Yorkers out of poverty. This year marks our 35th anniversary. Robinhood is now the largest philanthropic organization focused on local poverty in New York City. In each year, we raise and distribute all of our funds. In 2022, that was about 150 million and over 3 billion since our founding 35 years ago. Yes, that deserves applause. We deploy these resources to fund and connect and support effective organizations across the 5 boroughs. We advocate for policy change that can boost upward mobility. And we collaborate with government to grow what works so that evidence-based practices can operate at scale. We have a simple belief that where someone starts out in life shouldn't dictate where they end up. New York City can and should be an engine for economic mobility for everyone. And so that's what brings us today to today's program. Our morning has 3 parts. First, our partners from the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University will share data being released today as part of our annual report on the state of poverty and disadvantage in New York City. The data comes from Robinhood's Poverty Tracker. The Poverty Tracker surveys the same 4,000 families every couple of months over multiple years to understand how their household and financial circumstances change over time. This group is a representative sample of New York City, and the findings help create a more comprehensive picture of life in New York and guide us in our policy and programmatic work. This latest report contains a special focus about how the 2021 monthly child tax credit affected the well-being of New York children and their families. Our second session highlights one of the most important ongoing studies on child poverty. The Baby's First Year study examines how poverty reduction through cash support for new moms affects the brain development of the infants and toddlers in their families. Through a rigorous randomized controlled trial across 4 cities, including New York City, the study is breaking new ground about the causal impact of poverty and helps make clear what's at stake in our child policies. Robinhood is proud to be one of the financial supporters of this study, allowing researchers to capture more qualitative insights from the families about the impact of the additional cash in their lives. And third, we'll hear from a panel of leaders and advocates about the path forward in New York. Along with many partners here today, Robinhood urged the creation and passage of New York State's Child Poverty Reduction Act. The act mandates that New York develop a plan that can cut the state's child poverty in half within 10 years. This act follows in the footsteps of a 2019 report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which suggested packages of evidence-based policies that are capable of achieving this goal nationwide. The New York Act creates an advisory council to develop the state plan, and our panel will include 3 members of that council. Unfortunately, Dan Tietz, Commissioner of the State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, who co-leads the council and planned to join us, now has a budget hearing scheduled for today, so he can no longer make it. But we are fortunate to have with us New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof to moderate the conversation. We'll leave some time for Q&A after each session, so please don't hesitate to ask questions. And finally, just a thank you to all of our participants in today's program, and also to my colleagues who helped pull this event together. Our deep dive on child poverty this morning is actually the first in what will be a continuing deep dive series. Throughout the year, we'll be hosting additional forums and events similar to this one today, each focusing on an issue of critical importance in the fight against poverty. So thank you again to all of you for being here this morning. And with that background, I'm pleased to welcome and introduce our first presenters this morning. So Sophie and Jill, come on up. So as they come up, joining us from Columbia University is Sophie Collyer, Research Director of the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University, and her colleague, Jill Gandy, postdoctoral research scientist, also at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. Just a quick word, over the past decade, Robin Hood has built an invaluable research partnership with the Center in Columbia. We're so fortunate to have their expertise, not only in the poverty tracker, but in helping us think about the potential return on investment and impact of other anti-poverty policies. And no one has been more out front in analyzing and sharing work of the child tax credit than you all. So it's a pleasure to have you be here.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Matt, and thank you for the support from Robin Hood that makes this study possible. Today, my colleague Jill and I are going to draw on data from the Poverty Tracker to talk about the state of poverty and disadvantage in 2021 and the effect of different government policies on these experiences. And Jill will focus specifically on the effects of the 2021 child tax credit expansion. Well, let's make sure I know how to make. Okay, welcome. Okay, so what does the data tell us? Now, the Poverty Tracker measures 3 core measures of disadvantage in New York City: income poverty, material hardship, and health problems. And altogether, these combined are our measure of disadvantage in the city. And I'll start by talking about income poverty in 2021. So here we show the rates of adult poverty and child poverty in the city, as well as nationally, with the navy blue being New York City and the pink being the national rates. Now, we all know that the pandemic upended life in New York City for many New Yorkers and their families, most, if not all. But while we might have expected that to see a substantial increase in the poverty rate in response to the pandemic, these figures run counter to that expectation. We actually see stable rates of poverty for adults in the city at 18% in 2019 and 2021, and declining rates of child poverty falling to 15% in 2021 in New York City. It's the lowest for which we can measure, year for which we can measure in the Poverty Tracker data. And as Matt spoke of earlier, we have this historic low rate of child poverty at the national level. So how, right? Like, how is this the case? And these stable rates, and in the case of child poverty, falling rates of poverty, are a testament to the efficacy of quick and effective government policy response to the pandemic. And the data really bears this out. So every year, government policies like SNAP and unemployment insurance keep millions of people above the poverty line across the country. But in recent years, government policy played an even greater role in reducing poverty than in years prior to the pandemic. So, and this is due to expansions to things like SNAP and unemployment insurance, to stimulus checks, and the historic expansion to the federal child tax credit. So in 2019, we see that the adult poverty rate was cut by 34% by government policy and the child poverty rate by 51%. Again, this is in New York City. But in 2021, these effects grew to 44% and 68%. And overall, policies kept close to 1 million adult New Yorkers above the poverty line and 500,000 children in the city above the poverty line. Had these policy interventions not been in place, that initial figure that we looked at would likely have looked a lot different, and we would have seen a sharp increase in the poverty rate in response to the pandemic. But again, these results tell a different story. Now, at this point, many of these pandemic era policy expansions have expired, and evidence at the national level tells us that poverty rates are rising, particularly for children. So between December 2021 and January 2022, with the rollback of the federal child tax credit expansion, we saw 4 million children fall back below the poverty line just immediately in response to that. So in future years, we will continue to track the rates of poverty in the city and how they responded to the rollback of these policies at the local level. Now, we also know that many New Yorkers lived on the verge of poverty. And here we look at the share of New Yorkers falling into 4 different income groups. So you'll see again that 18% of adults were in poverty in 2021, but also 31% were considered low income. So this means that their incomes fell below twice or 200% of the poverty line. This is much higher than we see at the national level as well. And we also know from prior poverty tracker analyses that this group is the most likely to fall into poverty the subsequent year. So we track families over time, and that group is much more likely to fall below the poverty line as well as face hardships in subsequent years. And one other point is the rates of material hardship, which I'll speak about in a moment, are pretty similar between low-income families and families in poverty. So they're experiencing the same challenges, just getting by and support covering basic needs. So overall, about half of New Yorkers were either in poverty or below the poverty line in 2021. Now, as I mentioned, the poverty tracker measures other core measures of disadvantage beyond income poverty, including material hardship, which is defined as your inability to just meet basic needs like cover food expenses, medical costs, housing, and utilities. And here we show that the share of adults and children in families facing material hardships. These results make clear that it's not just those living below the poverty line who are struggling to make ends meet. Material hardship is more common in New York City than poverty. But in 2021, material hardship actually decreased compared to pre-pandemic years. In 2015 through 2021, about 1 in 3 adults in the city faced material hardship. And in 2021, we see this fall to 1 in 4. The reductions in the share of children in families facing material hardship was even more pronounced, falling from about 36% to 26% between those years. As with the poverty trends in 2021, these declines in hardship are partially attributable to this expansive government policy that was in effect in 2021. And Jill will discuss specifically the effects of the expanded CTC on children and families' experiences of material hardship. Now, the final core measure of disadvantage that we track is health problems. And that's defined as having a work-limiting health condition or self-reporting that you have poor health. We also track trends in psychological distress. And here we see that roughly 1 in 5 New York City adults faced health problems in each year between 2016 and 2021. So that's the pink line. But when we include psychological distress in this measure, we see that it's both of a higher prevalence, and we see a sharp uptick in 2020, underscoring the effect of the pandemic on the mental health of New Yorkers. In 2021, we see this fall a bit, but the prevalence of health problems or psychological distress remains above the pre-pandemic levels. Now, the poverty tracker data also shows that poverty, material hardship, and health problems are not equally distributed across demographic groups in New York City, and policy plays a role in both creating and mitigating these inequities. In 2021, disadvantage, by which we mean experiencing poverty, material hardship, or health problems, was significantly more common among Asian, Black, and Latino New Yorkers than white New Yorkers. Latino New Yorkers were also twice as likely to be living in poverty compared to white New Yorkers, and rates were similarly elevated among Asian and Black New Yorkers. We also find differences in rates of disadvantage by borough, with experiences of all forms of disadvantage being highest in the Bronx. The data also show that women experience higher rates of all forms of disadvantage, and New Yorkers born outside the United States face significantly higher rates of poverty and material hardship but a lower prevalence of health problems compared to US-born New Yorkers. Now, altogether, the poverty tracker data shows that 2021 was not a year without its challenges, but it also provides evidence of how effective policy can be at reducing poverty and hardship. It's a lesson that is so important now, given that the policies that helped keep hardship rates and poverty rates lower in 2021 have since expired in large part. Now, Joe will take us through a deeper look at one of these policies, the effects of the 2021 child tax credit expansion.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Sophie discussed, certain government policies like the child tax credit can be extremely effective for reducing poverty. The CTC helps families manage the cost of raising children. Under current law, the credit is worth up to $2,000 per eligible child. However, families with annual earnings below $2,500 receive no credit, and single parents with 2 children and earnings between $2,500 and $30,000 receive only a partial credit. In addition to excluding the lowest income families, only a portion of the credit is refundable, meaning that families with earnings so low that they owe little to no income tax are unable to claim the full credit amount. Today and prior to the 2021 expansion, roughly 1 in 3 children in New York State are ineligible for the full credit. And in portions of the Bronx, over 2/3 of children are ineligible for the full credit. But the expansions through the American Rescue Plan made the full credit available to nearly all children. In response to the massive job and income loss that followed the start of the pandemic, and in recognition that the existing CTC program left out the families who needed it the most, Congress expanded the CTC in 2021. The expansion removed the earnings requirement, increased the benefit values to $3,000 for kids over 6 and $3,600 for kids under 6, and made the credit fully refundable. It also delivered payments in monthly installments in the second half of 2021, but this was discontinued by 2022. We leveraged poverty tracker data to study the effects of this temporary expansion in New York City by adding questions designed to measure these effects to more than 7,000 surveys with using the poverty tracker and early childhood poverty tracker. Our analyses found results that suggested that the CTC cut child poverty in New York City by more than 30% in 2021 and kept roughly 120,000 children out of poverty. That amounts to a 75% increase in its anti-poverty effect compared to prior law. The increase in benefit amounts also led to significant declines in material hardship among New York City's families with children during the months when the payments were made. Overall, the CTC payments led to a roughly 10% reduction in the risk of any hardship among families with children in our poverty tracker sample. We even find greater reductions in these forms of hardship among families in poverty. As you can see with the dark purple line, these payments reduce the risk of hardship by 14%, financial hardship by 39%, and food hardship by 19% during the months of during the period with the monthly payments. We also found effects on food pantry use. Families with children were 21% less likely to visit food pantries during these months, and those in poverty were 33% less likely. Now, importantly, we find no evidence that the monthly CTC payments reduced parental labor force participation. These findings underscore how effective the CTC can be at reducing poverty and hardship. However, the expansions that improved its efficacy have since expired, and Congress has failed to garner bipartisan support for reinstatement. I will turn it now back over to Sophie, who will discuss what this means for New York.
Yeah, so the results from the poverty tracker make clear that policy can be extremely effective at reducing poverty and hardship. And as we've noted, this policy has since expired. There is a tremendous amount of advocacy, though, being done at the federal level to reinstate this policy as well. And it was called on in the State of the Union last week also for its reinstatement by President Biden. But at the same time, there's an amazing amount of work being done across the country at the state level to create similar policies that help families keep up with the day-to-day costs of raising children, including here in New York State. And I'll speak briefly about one of these opportunities. Okay, so some states actually have their own child tax credits that are linked to the federal credit. In New York State, it's called the Empire State Child Credit. And New York was a real leader in establishing this. Is one of the only states that actually had one of these credits before the past year, where now there's been a lot more work at the state level. But because it's linked to the federal credit, it replicates many of the design issues with the federal credit. So that is, it phases in with earnings. So children in the lowest income households are not eligible for the full credit. It also, children under age 4 are entirely ineligible for the credit. Another gap is, overall about 40% of children are ineligible for the full CTC, federal Empire State Child Credit. There's many credits, for so for the full Empire State Child Credit. And for 27% of it, it's because they are low income. And for 13%, it's just because they're simply under age 4. Now, working with Robinhood, we modeled what some of the effects would be if these design flaws were addressed. And these ideas I know are currently also being discussed by legislators in Albany. Now, at a high level, if New York State fixed the design flaws associated with the credit phase-in and refundability, extended the credit to children under age 4, and increased the benefit amount from $330 to a max of $1,000 per child, the credit would be associated with a 16.4% reduction in the child poverty rate at the state level and move over 100,000 children above the poverty line. Now, estimates show that this would cost $2 billion per year, but it would also generate $18.6 billion in benefits for society. Now, you might wonder, how do you know that? Well, an extensive study led by Irwin Garfinkel and supported by Robinhood, and Irva's here today, pulled together all of the most rigorous studies of the effects of income on the experiences of children and their families and parents. And these studies consistently show that when income rises from transfers like the CTC, children's health improves, their earnings increase as adults, as do the taxes that they pay. They're less likely to receive benefits as adults, they attend school for longer, and they're less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. Studies also find that parents' health and longevity improves as a result of such transfers. And these are just some of the long-term benefits that would result from fixing the design flaws in the federal and state CTC. And these long-term benefits clearly add up. This investment of $2 billion per year to expand the Empire State Child Credit is associated with this long-term benefit of $18.6 billion in benefits for society. Now, we all know that poverty and disadvantage are top of mind issues for everyone in this room, but the latest data that we presented today also shows that there are policy tools at hand that can address it and have an immediate and long-term effect. So thank you so much, and we're looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Jill. We do have time for Q&A, so I'll open it up to the floor if anyone has questions about the data. Yep, sir.
I'm sorry, Michael Rochford, St. Nick's Alliance. Good morning. Can you explain the term material hardship and what impact that has on families?
Yes, of course. So we measure material hardship on the poverty tracker in 5 domains. And part of it is that we know there might be families who are living below the poverty line or above the poverty line, who are just also not able to afford rent or food because the poverty line is low, right? It's like a measure of extreme need. And so these measures of material hardship help us get a broader understanding of the financial constraints that families are facing. More specifically, our definitions are you're unable to afford to visit a doctor because of cost, to afford enough food for the month, to afford rent. You have your utilities shut off, or you've just run out of money before the end of the month. And so just from that description, it's obvious that those are indicators of some other form of financial hardship that families are facing, and we wanted to make sure to capture that.
Hi, Erin Noguchi, Association to Benefit Children. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I have a question with respect to the CTC implementation in New York City. I remember at ABC, we did a major mobilization to try to get all of our families in our community up, to actually receive it. Do you have a sense of the eligible children and families, what percentage actually got it, and whether there's a difference in terms of income level and access?
It's a great question and a really important one. So the American Rescue Plan was announced in March of 2021, and payments started going out in July, right? So this kind of huge change by the IRS to deliver these payments. And initially, it was guaranteed that they would get to families who were currently in the tax system, and we know that that's going to leave behind the most disadvantaged families. There was a portal set up to sign families up, which I'm sure a lot of people know about, and did work to make sure that that linkage was made. The precise data on how many people were able to use the portal or access it is not currently available from the IRS, unfortunately. But we do know when looking at, they've released data on how many payments were made in each month, and you do see this upward trend. So like the work to sign people up does seem to have brought more people into the system. But precisely how many people, it's hard to know, because there's also churn where people were deciding to defer the payments. So all in all, the exact numbers are not available, but we do know if people who were likely missed are the most families with the lowest incomes who didn't have a tax filing history. But that doesn't, it was a 6-month program, right? And so you wonder what that would look like in the long run with more of a lead up time and implementation time. But I remember seeing all of the texts coming in about like, sign up, and it was an amazing effort for everyone who led that. Thank you.
Hi there, Kate Breslin, Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy. Are there data that disaggregates by race and ethnicity around the impacts? And can you talk about that and any data that you have related to immigrant eligibility on?
So we weren't able to disaggregate the results that Jill shared to get precise estimates by race and ethnicity, just because the sample size was somewhat limited and we weren't able to do that. But what we do know is that under current law, half of Black children and half of Latino children are ineligible for the full CTC because of the parameters that Jill described. So in the sense of income, we know that that expansion would disproportionately benefit Black and Latino children because of the current structures leaving so many of them behind.
Dava Shub, Children's Museum of Manhattan. I was curious to understand why children under 4 are not eligible for the Empire tax credit. That's
Great question.
I wanted to someone's logic in deciding it, not yours, but it's hard to fathom.
I unfortunately don't have an answer to that. But it's, I mean,
there is not a logical answer. There's no policy rationale for that.
Yeah.
Hi, Mary Ann Liam, the COO at Ascend. So I work for a school system, and I was thinking about how you were talking about these tax credits going away and the benefit that they've had. I'm curious if there's an amplifying effect when you think about other factors that can support some of the benefits that you've seen in the past year, how other organizations or things in the ecosystem can support and maintain some of the momentum that it's created. Does that question make sense?
Well, I think right now there's so much momentum at the state level, particularly because of the Child Poverty Reduction Council and such that we, in terms of what's closest, that is a very close, policy to everyone in the city and state. And I think that for the reasons just discussed, there are structures within that credit that really don't align with what its potential could be if they were fixed. So I hope that answers your question. But you know, it'd be interesting also to hear from school provider, like from school systems, if there was any reports on how families were using this with this money. I mean, I know from our qualitative work, we found people reporting like spending the money on school supplies at the beginning of the year. And it'd just be kind of interesting if there's any anecdotal evidence from schools about families talking about the credit.
But the question you're asking is sort of the big question for all of us, is sort of what can we do? We've just seen this historic, unbelievable success that is now not going forward. And so maintaining attention on this specific policy, obviously critical, but then all of the supports that so many of the folks in this room are involved in for young children, equally important. And hopefully gatherings like this and connections with your fellow colleagues can help us move forward.
Hi, I'm Courtney Bryant with the Center for Justice Innovation, formerly the Center for Court Innovation, and I'm curious about the methodology behind the savings on criminal justice costs, and wondering whoever was responsible for that, what the breadth of that was, looking both at obviously young people, but their families, and how that was, how you got to the number.
That's a great question. And Irv is here. It's hard to put you on the spot. Okay.
Pass the mic to Irv. We'll get as many as we can.
So there are a couple studies that underlie our estimates of the effects of giving money to poor people on crime. One of them just came out literally about 6 months ago. The other isn't actually published yet, but it's been around for a few years. They both rely on the implementation of the food stamp program. So food stamps was rolled out very slowly over a period of time between 1965 and 1974. By 74, all counties in the country had a food stamp program. But before that, it was literally county by county that implemented food stamps. So using census data, and this is not my research, this is other people's research, using the differences in county implementation, you both can do a before, after, and across county study. So it's a natural experiment. David Card, the economist, got the Nobel Prize this last year for his invention of natural experiments. So all the research that we underlie our estimates are one form or another of a natural experiment, but there are only two that have looked at crime. Crime is, if you prevent a crime, there's savings for criminal justice costs. So you need fewer people would be in prison, so on and so forth. But the biggest costs are actually the costs to victims. So you can think of murder as, and the value of a life, economists of the federal government averages about $10 million. The next most expensive crime is rape in terms of victim costs. And that's about $500,000. So there's, and then aggravated assault of any kind is next. Robbery is less, it's more like 20,000 per crime. It's not zero, the victim cost. When you add up all the victim costs and the criminal justice costs, the victim costs are actually about 3/4 of the total. And And if you think about it, that's why crime is such an important political issue, because crime entails lots of costs. That's a short version of what we've done.
All right, I think we have time maybe for one more. Yep, in the back.
Hello, I'm Isaac McGinn from Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance and working on the Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council. Thanks for the presentation. I was looking at the hardship data, and I'm looking in particular at the housing hardship. In a lot of the public reporting that I read, I feel like housing is cited as one of households' most significant expenses. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how housing was described as a hardship here. I'm just a little bit surprised to see it ranked lowest among these 5 things.
It's a great question. So our measure of severe housing hardship is either living in shelter or a place not meant for housing. So we also have measures of falling behind on rent or mortgage payments, which are much higher, and we can share those numbers. But this is the kind of the severest form of housing hardship.
Cool. Well, please join me in thanking Sophie and Jill. Thank you, guys. So we got the great question of how come the Empire Child Credit doesn't include children under 4, and our next presenters will speak a little bit to the potential effect on infants and toddlers of unrestricted cash. I'd like to battery. It's nice. Good. Thanks, guys. Professor Kim Noble. So Kim is one of the core principal investigators of the Baby's First Year study. And she's part of a dream team of academics from a consortium of universities involved in the study. And it's garnered attention rightfully in not only academic circles, but policy circles, in the media, because it's rigor, scale, and in the obvious implications on how we think about child poverty going forward. So Kim is the professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I'm pleased to introduce her. And then shortly, Dr. Hiro Yoshikawa, who is the Courtney Sale Ross Professor of Globalization and Education at NYU Steinhardt, and also a researcher on the Baby's First Year study. So let me hand it over to you, and here's the clicker.
Thanks so much, Matt. Okay, so we heard from that wonderful presentation from Sophie and Jill about the rates of poverty and in New York City and how they reflect risk for other outcomes. So what we're really interested in our study is the extent to which changing family income will make a difference for child development and family well-being. So work by my social science colleagues has suggested that indeed small differences in family income, especially early in childhood, seem to make a difference for children and families. So for example, just a $4,000 difference in annual income between the prenatal year and age 2 has been associated with higher scores on school achievement tests, increased adult earnings when those children grow up, increased time spent in the labor force when those children grow up, and even some evidence for improved health in adulthood. But in science, we have a saying, correlation is not causation, right? So we know that these differences in family income are associated with these differences in outcome, but we can't say for sure whether changing family income would cause differences in children's outcomes. And so that's where the Baby's First Year study comes in. So what is Baby's First Years? So back in 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 moms living with low income from 4 cities around the US, including New York City. And upon enrolling in the study, the moms were told that they would receive a monthly unconditional cash gift every month for the first several years of their children's lives. We recruited these moms in the postpartum wards of hospitals, so essentially from birth, and then they've been getting these monthly unconditional cash gifts that they've been free to spend however they would like. But critically, the moms have been randomized to one of two groups. So the group that we call the high cash gift group is receiving $333 a month, or about $4,000 a year. And the group that we call the low cash gift group is receiving $20 a month, or $240 a year. And those amounts were chosen very intentionally. Now, it was long before the Biden administration launched the American Rescue Plan. We began planning the study about 10 years ago, but we chose those amounts both because of the social science literature linking about $4,000 a year to improvements in children's outcomes. And from a policy perspective, we reasoned that that was an amount that would resonate with policymakers in that it was similar in size to other social services and benefits that moms facing low income were likely to qualify for. Now, to date, we've put more than $7 million into the pockets of the moms in our study. And by measuring the differential impact of the cash gifts on children's outcomes and family well-being, we'll be able to assess the causal impact of poverty reduction on early childhood development and family life. Now, the cash gifts are dispersed on a debit card branded as the For My Baby card. It was automatically activated in the hospital postpartum ward at the time of enrollment into the study. And mom walked out of the hospital with her first disbursement on the card, and then she gets disbursements automatically each month on the day of the child's birthday. They're accompanied by a text message reminder to let mom know that the disbursement has taken place. And we worked very hard before the launch of the study to ensure that to the extent possible, these cash gifts wouldn't count in determining eligibility for other social services and benefits. So other benefits that the mom might qualify for, to the extent possible, wouldn't be clawed back. So I've been using the word cash gift, you may have noticed. That's intentional. That's because they meet the legal definition of a gift. So mom doesn't have to participate in research to continue to receive the gifts. And because of that, that means that they're not taxable. We didn't have to collect a social security number or a tax ID at the time of enrollment. And as I mentioned, we worked hard to ensure that they wouldn't have other benefits clawed back. So in 2 of the 4 cities, including New York City, that meant going agency by agency to obtain waivers. In the other 2 cities, we actually obtained state legislation saying that for these moms in this study, this money won't count in determining their eligibility for benefits. That was work led by 2 of our other principal investigators, Catherine Magnuson and Lisa Janetian. Okay, so at baseline, our 2 groups are balanced on demographic considerations like race and ethnicity. Across the study, about 40% of the moms are Black, about 40% are Latina, about 1 in 5 report being married. Their average household income at baseline was about $22,000. So the cash gift in the high cash group increased family income by about 20%. And 95% reported receiving some kind of government benefit at baseline. And I'm happy to say that we've maintained high retention rates over the course of the study. So in the first 3 follow-up waves of data collection, we've retained more than 92% of the sample at each wave. Okay. Quickly, let me just walk you through where we are in the course of the study. So I mentioned that we recruited the moms beginning in the spring of 2018. We recruited them over the space of a year. And then every year subsequently, we followed up with the families at around the time of the children's birthdays. Now, initially at age 1, around the time of the children's first birthdays, we were traveling into the families' homes in order to obtain survey information from the moms. We were having them do a 10-minute free play with their kids that we were video recording and coding for subsequent parenting behavior. We were getting a measure of mom's stress hormone, some maternal report measures of language and social emotional development, and an in-home measure of children's brain activity that I'll tell you about in a moment. Now, of course, in March 2020, the pandemic struck, which meant that it was no longer safe or feasible to travel into families' homes. We were able to quickly pivot and begin administering phone surveys. So while our overall retention was about 93% for that age 1 wave, those rich in-person measures like child brain activity, unfortunately, had a much smaller sample. Because of the pandemic, we continued to conduct data collection remotely at ages 2 and 3. But I'm happy to say the ongoing wave of age 4 data collection is that we're back in action. So we've been inviting the families into our university labs around the country to conduct an in-depth assessment of child development, including brain activity. So that data collection is ongoing. We'll be finished with that data collection this summer, so I'll have to come back next year to tell you about that. Okay, so I did want to share some of the early preliminary findings though. So how did the first year of cash gifts appear to impact children's brain activity? So first a quick primer on the brain. I promise it won't be too painful. So how do we go about measuring brain activity in young children? So we use this device known as electroencephalography, or EEG. It involves placing this cap of electrodes on the child's head. It's pretty forgiving to movement, so the child can sit comfortably on their caretaker's lap. And you can think of those electrodes as similar to microphones, listening into the brain's activity. Now, we're not mind readers. Of course, we don't know what someone is thinking, but we are able to measure the speed of brain activity. And we care about that speed of brain activity for a few reasons. So first of all, everybody has some high speed or high frequency brain activity and some lower speed or lower frequency brain activity. That's normal. We all have some of both. But we know that as kids get older, they tend to develop more of that high frequency or fast-paced brain activity and less of that low frequency or slow-paced brain activity. That's part of normal development. Now, we also know that kids who are at risk for learning and attention problems in school tend to exhibit less of that fast-paced brain activity than their peers. And finally, and relevant for today, we also know that unfortunately, kids facing early adversity, including poverty, are more likely to exhibit less of that fast-paced brain activity and more slow-paced brain activity compared to their more advantaged peers. And so we set out to ask whether these cash gifts would reverse that pattern. So specifically, we hypothesized and pre-registered that infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more of that fast-paced brain activity and less of that slow-paced brain activity compared to the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. So before I show you what we saw, I will tell you that this was really an unprecedentedly successful data collection effort in the homes of low-income families. Usually when we collect brain activity data, we do it from the comfort of the research lab, we minimize distractions, it's quiet. Obviously, when we're traveling into homes, that's not an option. This was work that was largely spearheaded by our incredible postdoctoral researcher, Sonia Troller-Renfrey, who's joining the faculty at Teachers College in the fall. Because of her incredible efforts, the majority of families agreed to try it. In 84% of those in-person visits, the babies were successfully capped, which yielded high quality usable data in about 72% of the sample. This is similar to the rate of data collection that we would expect in the lab. Now, of course, this was a much smaller number than the 1,000 families who were enrolled because we had to stop going into the homes because of the pandemic. So what did we find? So to walk you through this, if you can imagine someone lying on their back with their feet into the screen, I'm showing you the average brain activity across the sample. And here on the top, I'm showing you fast-paced brain activity with warmer colors representing more fast-paced brain activity. And so you can see pretty clearly visually that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group showed more fast-paced brain activity than the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. Likewise, when we look at very fast-paced brain activity, we see again, the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group showed more very fast-paced brain activity than the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. And we were able to see that after just 1 year of this monthly unconditional cash support. Now, notably, this was driven by differences in parts of the brain that are known to support thinking and learning. So this is very tantalizing evidence that we're already making a difference in child brain development after just 1 year. Now at age 4, we're actually collecting direct assessments of cognition and behavior. So we'll be able to see the extent to which these effects persist and manifest as cognitive and behavioral differences that have potential implications for school readiness. Now, this work received worldwide attention, including a front page story in the New York Times, but we're certainly not finished. Again, we're in the process of continuing to follow up with these families as the kids get older. So preliminarily, the weight of the evidence suggests that reducing poverty may indeed cause changes in children's developing brains in a pattern associated with the subsequent developments of thinking and learning. It's really the strongest evidence to date that income may matter in and of itself for children's brain development. But again, we had somewhat limited statistical power because we had to stop data collection at the onset of the pandemic. So our age 4 data collection is underway. We've got lots of exciting measures that I'll tell you about at a future date. We're very excited though to get a handle on some of these direct assessments. Now I want to hand it over to Dr. Hiro Yoshikawa, who's going to tell us about the early impacts that we're seeing on family well-being.
Thanks. Thanks, Kim. So we're certainly excited by the preliminary impacts on brain development, but that raises the question I'm sure everyone or many of you are thinking about, which is why? Why might we see those effects? So when we started the study, we had two kind of big pathways of impacts that we hypothesized. One is this area of parental investment in children. And so the easiest way to think about that is this is cash. And so cash may be spent on materials that benefit children's development, right? You saw that For My Baby was on the card. This is actually a bit of the only intervention aside from the cash that we have here, but it is a reminder that is part of the experiment. And so you could imagine that investment could be in the form of materials, resources to reduce hardship in the family. It could be in the form of learning materials, for example. Things are actually for the child. It could be in the form of other household goods. And then it may be in the form of time. Because the models of investment from economics talk about both material resources and time, and that might mean more time to interact with an infant or toddler. The other big pathway that we hypothesized was more from sociology or psychology, and that is in the area of reduced stress. And this really goes along with the material hardship findings from the city and the poverty tracker study, right? So would there be reduced financial hardship, financial worry, food insecurity, and actual psychological distress and stress or depressive symptoms, for example? This is not to say that there aren't other forces that affect families in poverty, and particularly our sample. So we are being cautious by saying that a cash gift in and of itself cannot affect other sources of structural discrimination, such as racism, and these kinds of correlates of poverty. So we want to caution that that is something that we continue to recognize as an extremely powerful influence in these families' lives, but that a cash gift in and of itself is not something that we might necessarily expect could address some of the other structural forces that affect disparities and inequality. These pathways, we think, might affect parenting. As Kim mentioned, we got videotapes of parenting behavior. And so there are the prior evidence in these literatures suggests that increased parental investment might result in, for example, more stimulating activities with kids that reduce stress, might be associated with greater warmth and interactions, for example, so that both of these might affect early development by affecting parenting. Before I get to the mechanisms, just wanted to say that we, and this is, I think, relevant for New York City, especially if a debit card kind of approach is the modality for delivery. There were very few problems in the use of the card. We found that the card tended to be used right away, that about 1/3 was withdrawn at ATMs. There was a great diversity of transactions, which also was supported by the qualitative data. There was no single pathway or report of a type of spending that parents, there's a vast array, though of course, early in infants' lives, there was a lot of spending on things like diapers, formula, and those kinds of goods, some of which are not covered by WIC. For those of you who prefer bars to word clouds, these are the actual, and you can see ATM is by far the largest bar, representing about 1/3 of the total cash. This is bars representing amounts, with the total being all of the high cash gift distributed up to the point of 12 months. So you see very little. We observed very little spending at stores that we could identify as being liquor stores, for example, and this was borne out in our other forms of data, in the survey data, for example. So what are we seeing so far? We are seeing more money spent on child-specific expenditures, and particularly on things like diapers, books, or toys. Interestingly, and in line, I think, with the poverty tracker data, no detectable changes in maternal or family employment, and very few differences on money spent on alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs, as reported in spending or use of those substances. Puzzlingly, we're not seeing very much in terms of effects on maternal stress. So we hypothesized reductions in maternal stress, but we actually did not see changes one way or the other, in large part. And we obviously are still following the families. We expect that we might see some that show up later, but the qualitative data suggests that the cash gift is perceived as pretty uniformly positive in the lives of these moms. So we do have a little bit of a puzzle as to why we're not actually seeing reductions in stress. Looking ahead, we are transitioning to primary as these kids will be turning 6 in a couple years, and 8. We plan continued in-person data collection into the primary school years. And so we're excited about that. And I just wanted to tell you about one very exciting idea we plan to follow up on, we're raising money for right now, which is to follow up the older siblings. About 2/3 of the sample, when our focal child was born, actually had older siblings. And of course, the card, even though it said "for my baby," the moms were saying, "This is for my children." They were not always saying this is for just that baby. So we're very interested in seeing whether there are household level effects. We think that understanding the benefits and costs long-term of a benefit like an unconditional cash gift or cash transfer might be underestimated if we only look at one child and when there are other siblings who might potentially be affected. So that is something that we look forward to. We're here light on the policy implications because we think you should be drawing the policy implications. You all are on the advisory council. We look forward to that work and to the role of Robin Hood in this work to inform direct poverty reduction in New York City. But we do want to acknowledge that these results may have some implications. Of course, we don't have additional $300 or $333 a month per child, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And this was only for one child, that child who was born that month, that week in the hospital. So the magnitude of our cash reduction is actually lower than the child tax credit expansion was. We want to thank the many funders, including Robin Hood Foundation, for the generosity, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Once again, let me open it up for any questions in the room. Yes, on the far end there.
Hi, I'm Lauren Dawson, mother of 3. I guess I don't have any education in this or anything, but I guess what I'm interested in is when you pick these moms, do you do any research about their prenatal care beforehand or their education levels? Or besides the cash, I know that when I learned more about early childhood education, I became a better parent. So what I'm interested in is are you doing any classes for them? Or even the mother's mental health, because, $4,000 a year is obviously a huge deal to, lots of people. And I understand that. And with reducing the stress as being a mom or a parent, but I guess just exposing them to education and, how to get down on the floor with their kids or serve and return, all these types of things. Are you doing any of that either? Because that obviously has a lot to do with children's mental stimulation and everything.
Oh, great. Yeah. Great question. Thank you for asking it. So sort of a two-part question. Your first part was, to what extent did we measure things at birth, like parents' education? So we had a whole survey that we administered to moms before we even told moms that in our back pocket, we also had these cash gifts coming, right? So we said we were doing a longitudinal study of child development and family life. And then if they wanted to participate, we administered a survey. So we do know a fair bit about them at baseline before they were enrolled in the cash gifts per se. Your second question is very interesting. Are we providing another intervention like financial literacy or about serve and return or all the other important things that contribute to child development? And the answer is no, and that's very intentional because it was really designed to be a study of the pure impacts of income. Right. And so we can then take whatever impacts we see and subsequently compare effect sizes to other kinds of interventions. But we very explicitly and pointedly limited the intervention itself to income.
Yeah, the way I usually describe it is we have hundreds of evaluations of parenting programs and not a single causal impact evaluation of poverty reduction in the first years of life. So that's not to say that those programs aren't extremely important. Interestingly, we're seeing a hint at age 3 years that moms may be more involved in education and job training activities. So we did ask that in the survey, but that's just from the cash, right? Which is quite interesting. And we'll see if that holds up in any longer way.
Hi, Muzzy Rosenblatt, BRC. I was really interested in the slide you had about where the money went, because I think that is where the opportunity is to find allyship. I'm curious, for example, have you presented these findings to Procter & Gamble, to Nestle? Because I'm a big believer in following the money, right? So we're all interested in the things that the majority of stuff that we've been talking about, but that's not going to move the needle in terms of getting the tax credit reestablished. I think what'll move the needle is the people who are actually getting the financial benefits and seeing it's in their interest. And the comparable I would point to is the mortgage interest tax deduction, the most generous, incredible thing that we've got. Can you imagine how the banks in this country and the largest lobbying group, the National Association of Home Builders, would react if you couldn't write your mortgage off your taxes? And so if that's a direction you're going, great. And if it's not, I would encourage you to go there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Muzzy. Your strategic thinking on call right there. So thanks.
Jerry Hippolyte from Partnership with Children. I'm on this side right here. And so my question one, I saw the study started in 2018. And so one of my questions really speak to, is there any counter or supportive data that speaks to the suddenness of the pandemic, which really shifted what learning looked like? And so there are a bunch of youth that didn't go to childcare, kindergarten, or first grade. And this is the first time that they're entering second grade. The first time they're going in school. When I say entering second grade, I'm talking about in a school setting. And there's been so much learning loss in that space. And I know one of the foundations is parental investment as well as reduced stress. In the pandemic years, both of those levels were extremely high. And so was there any data or support factors to speak to that, to balance it out? Because it almost feels like the data may be skewed because of the pandemic.
Yeah, so the pandemic, of course, affected both groups, right? So this is a severe external shock and an ongoing one to both our high cash gift group and the low cash gift group. We have looked at whether childcare use changed and whether there was an impact. At 1, 2, and 3 years, we're not actually seeing an overall effect, but we're kind of just in the process of still running analyses to kind of delve into whether there are subgroup effects. I should add that overall, we didn't find a lot of subgroup differences in effects either by city or by race ethnicity, for example, but there's a lot more to dig into as far as that goes. And so we're still looking at those. But overall, we don't see effects on, for example, we were particularly interested in whether center care, which is harder to get, costs more, harder to find. Is that something that we would see an impact on? We didn't see it. We don't know whether we have to kind of disentangle kind of the COVID effects. And so I think part of it is waiting for our newer data and completely analyzing our newer waves of data.
Hi, it's so exciting to see these results. I had a question about the maternal stress effect or the lack thereof. We found the same thing with the CTC analysis that we did with the poverty tracker. And one theory that I keep coming across is this idea that maternal stress reductions are a very downstream effect that kind of come into play once you've made massive reductions on multiple different forms and types of hardship. And I am curious about any follow-up work you might be doing about exploring the magnitude of the effects on different forms of hardship and whether that might be related to not seeing any effect on maternal stress.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've been testing our model using the kind of family stress model, right? And we did get financial worry, psychological distress, overall stress. I mean, we got multiple measures of stress, parenting stress. It's a great idea to kind of look cumulatively across those. Is there a subgroup perhaps that is experiencing cumulative reductions in multiple kinds of hardship? Just looking measure by measure, we're not seeing much. But absolutely, one of our hypotheses is as these payments stretch longer into kids' lives, and we have funding right now to cover the first 6 years of children's lives. We originally had funding for the first 3 now. Kim has done a tremendous amount of fundraising. So we now will be able to look up to age 6 and see, are there some kind of cumulative effects that emerge after simply more time and more of this kind of stability that we hypothesized it would bring.
Hi, Barika Williams, Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. This wasn't my original question, but since this has just come up, I'd encourage you all to look at some of the housing voucher longitudinal studies, moving to opportunity, some of the other ones. They also likewise find no drop in parental and maternal stress in some of those ARC 10 plus years. So it's a interesting parallel that seems to be coming up. I think you touched on this a little, but I'm curious whether or not you've seen any disparities in terms of regional, urban, suburban, and also by race and ethnicity in the results and in the outcomes.
Yeah, no significant differences in impacts overall. But again, we're looking at specific outcomes in more detail. One of the limitations of our data is, for example, 40% are Black, 40% are Latina moms, but we don't have a large enough white group, for example, to actually make that comparison, but we can compare impacts among Black and Latina moms. And so far, we don't see it generally much in terms of statistically significantly different impacts. On the other hand, we were not really statistically powered to show very precise subgroup effects, for example, per city, right? Our whole sample is 1,000. So yeah, so we're a little bit limited in that.
Also, all of these sites are urban. I mean, you could argue about the urbanicity of New York City versus Omaha, for example, but we had to select locations where there was a dense enough population that within a few hospitals, we could recruit the sample.
Hi, Dia Bryant, the Education Trust New York. The brain activity, totally interesting for me, thinking about that 0 to 3 space where we know kids are just sponges. I'd love to hear your design ideas for working with the siblings, because you're in a totally different sort of developmental space if they're older, and just would love to hear what you all are thinking about in there.
Yeah, so, similar to what we're doing now at age 4 with the target kids, we expect that we'll be measuring cognitive outcomes like language, reading, math, executive functioning, or the ability to sort of control our thoughts and feelings, right? We'll again be measuring brain activity. The beauty of a measure like this is that we have a developmental trajectory really across the lifespan. So we can look not just in infancy, but as they reach toddlerhood and preschoolership and on upwards. We can also look at task-based brain activity. So how do our brains react when we're actually doing something, not just sort of sitting at rest, but when we're reading, for example, do we see differences? So lots of exciting potential outcomes for these older kids.
Greg Silverman, West Side Campaign Against Hunger and Roundtable New York City. really interested in hearing the words time and stress as measures and metrics. In the world I live in the anti-hunger, specifically food insecurity world, we're pushed to focus on really blunt instruments, right? Poundage, like how much poundage do you push out? What we know with our customers is that the time that it takes to get this food is incredibly impactful to them, and the stress associated with that. And when we've brought food to people, we've seen less stress on our lines, and it's more qualitative. But we'd love to hear how you're thinking about or how you measure time and stress, and if there's ways to take that for groups like Robin Hood and the Feeding America networks, as we think about like what's a simple measure of time and stress that would be way more, in my mind, impactful in the big picture of people's lives.
I'll let Hiro answer in a moment. I'll just say a couple things. So we're not seeing differences, at least yet, in food insecurity, but we are seeing some differences in mom's reports of the nutritious foods that she's feeding her children. So a study that we're going to submit for review this week actually shows higher reports of fresh produce consumption among the kids. So, some early evidence that you might be interested in. In terms of time use, we have a little bit in the measures that we've obtained, mostly about mom's time with the child. So for example, moms are reporting more time each week engaged in reading with and playing with their children in the high cash gift group compared to the low cash gift group.
One area where time and stress really come together is this notion of cognitive bandwidth. So I think Lisa Janetian on our team has led the work to try to figure out and prioritize how do we measure that, especially in this age 4 follow-up. And so we're measuring a mom's executive function skills and things like their response time within that kind of task. So those are some of the kinds of ways that I think if you think of what the combination of time pressure and other kinds of financial stress produce are the powerful studies from all around the world showing that seasonal cycles of hardship, for example, can reduce cognitive bandwidth among adults depending on the poverty and hardship that they're experiencing. So that's driven some of our hypotheses and our future information gathering. But we would love to hear creative ideas because I think how people estimate time is kind of, it's not easy to get with survey measures that don't take a huge amount of time. So we've done, very focused bits, but yeah, we're still exploring some of those.
Hi, Tia Morris from Teach for America, New York. Hello. Dia touched on the first part of my question, actually, but I'm curious with the young people as they're 4 or 5 or the older siblings, are you collecting any other sort of academic data, attendance data or information about the schools to really try to, understand where the impact may or may not be coming from?
Yeah, we plan to get we have a huge administrative data agenda, which involves use of public benefits, school records once kids get to that age. And so that's all part of our grant proposals right now. So let's all hope that NIH pulls through on the research and other funders.
Hi, thank you. Michelle Yantry, Good Shepherd Services. This is really more of an observation from your last slide about policy implications. And it's also equally to the first panel and really to all of us. And that is just really did you give any considerations to the policy implications for probably the most direct way to impact family income, which is wages? And, at what point are we going to really have to reckon with the reality? And in light of the work that's being done right now in New York, at least around measuring the true cost of living, the degree to which wages just don't support families not to be in poverty for most of the, the groups that are being looked at for these studies.
Yeah, certainly. I think some of us on the PI group are very interested, have been interested historically in things like wage growth and whether and those kinds of trajectories take time to estimate. Right now, we're not seeing a lot one way or the other in terms of the employment kinds of outcomes, whether they're full-time, part-time, or hours. And I believe I'm not sure we got wages at every time point, but that is something that's a very good point, in the sense that in the past, income support policies have on occasion produced higher wage growth. This is back in the welfare reform experiment days, right? For those of you who remember those data sets, but I think that's a very important question. We'll be delving in more detail into the economic impacts in future waves.
And Michelle, I think your point is just wage policy generally has some of the same implications. We know that the rise in the minimum wage in New York City moved hundreds of thousands of families out of poverty and near poverty. But the value of that $15 minimum wage has been eroded by inflation. And so we're faced now with the policy question of how and whether to tie the minimum wage to the cost of living. So very important question, sort of a preview to our next panel also. But any other questions for babies' first years?
Hi, David Harrington, United for Brownsville. I was wondering if you looked at any impacts on child development, so developmental milestones.
So we have looked at mom's report of developmental milestones, and so far we're not seeing differences between the groups and what mom is reporting. But the real, the measures that we really care about the most are the direct assessments, and that's what we're doing now. So we haven't been able to be in person with the children since the middle of age 1. So now at age 4, we're getting standardized measures of things like vocabulary and early literacy skills, among others. So we'll have more to say soon.
Kristen.
Hi, Kristen Moore, Center for New York City Affairs, and this in some ways builds off of Michelle's question. And I don't mean this to sound as obnoxious as it will, but like, is $4,000 enough? These families are still in poverty or near poverty, and we want to see all of these amazing gains, but is that going to happen with 4,000?
Yeah, I mean, we wrestle with that all the time, right? So it increased the annual income of these families by about 20%, but by no means did it lift all of them out of poverty. By no means is this any type of universal basic income or anything along those lines. Likewise, so we're seeing early impacts on the investment pathway. So we're seeing that moms are spending more money and more time with their kids, but we're not seeing reductions in stress. And it's impossible to know if money doesn't change stress or if it just wasn't enough money to move that needle.
Yeah, when we decided and picked that number, it was at that moment about 10 years ago, what might be a feasible, what was both in the research associated with about a 0.2 effect size on achievement, for example, for older kids, as well as something that we thought would be kind of feasible in the realm of the EITC or an expansion of the EITC, or we certainly weren't expecting a landscape where the magnitude of the CTC expansion was possible. And of course, New York has a much higher cost of living than New Orleans. We have New Orleans also in the sample, but so of course there's a limit. We can't go back and change. So.
Last question.
Well, and good segue maybe to the next panel, but Larry Marks with the Children's Agenda. I'm curious what briefings you may have done for policymakers at the federal level, at the state level on these findings and what you're finding in the reception.
Yes, so we have done them at the first point that some of our 12-month findings were available. We did do a series of fairly private briefings on the Hill because they were preliminary results to the feds. And then we both, I think at Matt's urging, testified to the New York State legislature around that age 4 issue with Empire State Credit and bringing some of our findings to bear on that. Unfortunately, that didn't move, but we're very hopeful with these plans that we're hearing about now.
Yeah, we're happy to talk to anybody about our results. We've given briefing to White House staffers and congressional staffers. We won't do public briefings unless the results are published or at least publicly available. But we're happy to talk to anybody who wants to hear from us.
Please join me in thanking Kim and Hiro. So coming into our final conversation, where do we go from here? And just hearing folks' questions and hearing your affiliations and just seeing friends, it's always such an honor to be in a room of Robin Hood partners, because I know all of you are so deeply personally invested in this work day to day. So really, the folks who are coming up here kind of stand in for all of us to talk about where we go from here. But I don't think we could ask for a better group. So if folks could join, that includes first my boss and Robinhood's CEO, Rich Buery, to join the conversation. Dia Bryant, the Executive Director of Education Trust, New York. Kate Breslin, Chief Executive Officer of the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy. And I'd like to welcome Sophie Collyer back up to join us. And finally, thank you again to Nick Kristof for agreeing to moderate our panel. Nick is such a powerful and moral voice for children and families. And it's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you.
Thank you all. And, you know, this is a really, I think, important moment on this issue. The past couple of sessions have underscored one thing that is new, which is compared to 10 years ago, we have a lot more evidence about what works, at what cost, in a way that we historically did not. And now we also have the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which we hope will be a really powerful tool to address this issue. And I would just say that, you know, as somebody coming from the other side of the country, the eyes of the whole country are on New York. And if New York can pull this off, that will be a really powerful lesson for everybody. So, so let me start. Rich, how do you see this moment? And in particular, the Child Poverty Reduction Act. Is this a real opportunity that can bring about that kind of change, or is this going to end up sort of a bone tossed to those of us who care deeply about this issue?
Thanks, Nick. Well, I think for all of us, is that working? Yeah. Thank you for the question. I mean, look, I think all of us in this room are probably optimists by nature, or we wouldn't be here in this room. But I do think there's an incredible opportunity through the combination of attention and this unexpected real world evidence base of the very real impact that very clear public policies can have to drive changes in the child poverty rate and the family poverty rate. You know, I'm struck by Mothy's comment earlier that obviously if being right or having evidence was enough, we live in a very different world. And so as with all things, the question becomes politically, how do we create momentum, create enough political energy so that these very high evidence-based interventions actually can live? And part of that can be, I think, around by identifying new allies. But fundamentally, it's a question about how do we build power among constituencies that care about this work.
And Kate, I'm a enormous, believer in this. But let me ask a skeptical question, and that is that when we look at difficult problems that we care a lot about, housing, carbon emissions, then the tendency has been to set ambitious goals and announce we're going to, 2002 New York advocates, okay, here's our plan to end homelessness, carbon emissions repeatedly. Here's how we're going to slash carbon emissions. How do we make sure that this is different and that 10 years from now, we don't have another deep dive and say, that instead of being a spur to action, it became a substitute for action?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think it's incumbent on all of us. I'm so glad you referred to the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which commits New York State to cutting child poverty in half in 10 years as a tool, because that's what it is. It doesn't do the thing that we want it to do. It gives us another tool to do the thing. And I think we need to think of it as a Swiss Army knife that has a lot of different parts, and we all have to figure out how we are going to use it to make it happen. And we're working, and we're all working together to try and make sure that everyone's bringing their voice to this, both on the outside. So it's not as though a council starts and then, does the things, the council is going to make recommendations. And it's up to all of us to urge our policymakers to make sure that it happens and to make sure that when we do it in 10 years, that we keep tracking, that we keep doing the work.
So how do we provide that accountability?
So I would argue we need to keep asking our policymakers. So just as an example, one of the things that we're working with many of you in this room on is talking to state leaders, policymakers, legislators, and asking them what's happening this year in this legislative session or in this budget session that's going to move the needle on child poverty. So always asking the question, shining the light on it, and being relentless about asking the question. And there's an expectation of measurement over time. So we'll be observing how we're doing over time. And I should point out that one key component of the legislation is attention to racial inequity, because we saw from our friends the huge racial inequities in poverty, that we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently making that worse.
And our collective job is that accountability role. That's our job. So Kate mentioned the racial inequity challenge, and the Child Poverty Reduction Act explicitly calls for that focus, and that makes sense. You can't think seriously about poverty in New York or in America without thinking seriously about racial inequities. And yet there's also quite a bit of evidence that the moment you frame inequities in terms of race, you lose support for change. And so President Obama and some others have argued that it may be more effective in terms of building support to frame issues in terms of class as kind of a proxy for race. And so how do we think about this? I mean, how do we have this huge racial inequity challenge, but the moment we talk about it, we lose support?
Nick, that is a wonderful question. And I'm trying to find the words. The truth of the matter is it is a fact that in this country, if you have melanated skin and you come from, I'm from Detroit originally, or you worked in East New York where I was a principal, or you worked in Fort Greene before gentrification where I was a teacher, it is a fact that life is different. And if we want to continue to find ways to cover that fact, sort of detour around it, we'll never actually address the problem. The truth of the matter is that we don't need to study this anymore. We just had several experts tell us that people who live in poverty have an entirely different set of circumstances. And I would say, as a person who lived and grew up in poverty, I am a 1-hour flight away from the poverty that my family still lives in. So there is an interdependence that even when you are first gen and you get out and you go to Harvard, there is still a connection to that in terms of your identity and in terms of how you have to continue to show up for the people you love. And so if we think that we can get around that by saying this is a class issue, this is, an education issue, it is all of that. And it is a race issue, because one of the fundamental parts of the American DNA is racism, period.
Sophie, so Dia mentioned that, we know what to do. We have the tools.
Right.
And the challenge is political will. At times I've written that, I look at the polling on, and 97% of Americans agree that children should have broader opportunity at the beginning of life. 97% of Americans don't believe the earth is round. And the idea you can get 97% of people advocating for greater opportunity is incredible. And yet we somehow had the most effective intervention against child poverty imaginable, and we couldn't manage to sustain it. I mean, here in New York City, we had under Bill de Blasio, we had a remarkable expansion of early childhood education, and I don't know that that helped him politically. Who is the European leader who has done the most on child poverty? It was Tony Blair. He did reduce child poverty by half. And who is the European leader who is most reviled by my fellow liberals? It's Tony Blair. And so so it's not obvious to me, despite that polling, that it is actually in the interests of political leaders to reduce child poverty. And I hate to say that, I hate to think that, but how do we make it in their interest? How do we build that political will, looking at the British example or at the New York example or at the child tax credit example?
It's a great question. And, I'm not necessarily in the political science realm as much, but I think there are two things. First, the benefit cost analysis led by Irv just shows how this is not just political, this is a socially a hugely beneficial type of intervention. And keeping that at the front of conversations, I think, is key. Another thing that I just recognized last week when someone said to me, who's kind of a policy adjacent space, said, oh, well, that's why the government created the 2021 child tax credit. And I was like, the child tax credit has been in effect since the late 90s. and it was in effect in 2019. And it was the largest direct federal transfer to children, and 1 in 3 children did not receive it because they were low income. And so there's a lot, like, lack of clarity around what this system does and is. And I think that that is also an opportunity for people to communicate, what are people getting, who is getting it, and who's being left out. And keeping those numbers at the front of these conversations seems really important to me.
Yeah, okay.
I think this is also really tricky, because it's really clear that there's not one single thing that we can do. So there's no one policy that we can say, if we just do this one thing, it's going to solve. It's all of the things, and it's different things for different people. And so it's really tricky. And I think one of the reasons that, and pivoting a little bit, that we didn't, there were a lot of us who really tried to get the federal child tax credit expansion to continue. And it's for the people whose lives were dramatically impacted by it, they are living their lives. And it's hard to get grassroots support for things like that when people are busy living their lives and, paying their rent, doing all of those things.
I'm sorry, I think we're done. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, so in a certain way, it was us in the professional advocacy class, doing a lot of that.
Yeah, just a couple of disjointed thoughts. I mean, one, just to repeat what you said, of course, that there is not one silver bullet. There is not only one thing we need to do to create a just world of opportunity for our children. But there are political opportunities to take advantage of the attention of a particular policy. And so I do think there's a powerfully galvanizing idea behind something like the Child Poverty Reduction Act, because although it is not by itself enough to solve the problem, it does create the opportunity to have a conversation about the ways in which government can have an impact in a way that is meaningful to people's lives. And you talked about Mayor de Blasio's expansion of childhood, and fair enough to say that perhaps he did not get full political benefit from that. However, I talk to New Yorkers every day who understand and appreciate that the expansion of early childhood has made a difference in their lives. So I think I would not underestimate the opportunity of what happens when government does succeed on one big policy idea and what it can do to galvanize energy around an idea. And I think for Mayor de Blasio, one thing is not enough, perhaps, but I don't think it undermines the idea that those kind of wins can have broad impact and can excite people about what's possible when you organize around a powerful idea.
I think that's right, Rich. And I'd add, on the council, we actually have 2 women who are not professional advocates. They are not policy wonks. They are not folks who dig through data all day. They are the folks living the reason that we started this, right? And they are not there as accessories. They are there as full members contributing to the conversation with experiences that are significantly different from the stories we use to actually move policymakers. And when someone tells you like, listen, my SNAP is gonna run out because my oldest just turned 18, that is a real conversation. Doesn't mean that that child doesn't need any help anymore, but hearing that mother tell that story about what she's going through day in and day out is so critical. And having it included, and not just as sort of a coloring in the lines, they are there as full people, full participants, and full members. I think that's a really important part of this work.
Let me just toss out some questions to whoever wants to grab the hot potato. There's some funders watching, and they're besieged with phone calls and emails about great things to support. And even in this realm, there's a debate about funding services versus advocacy and change. And I don't. If I had $1 zillion, I have mixed feelings about that. In New York City, you see philanthropy really having an important effect on education at various levels, for example. On the other hand, I always think that we didn't try to build the interstate highway system with volunteers and bake sales. We did it because it was a priority, and why shouldn't child poverty be the same kind of a priority? And so, what advice do you have for funders on services versus advocacy? How do we think through that choice and that differing approaches? Anybody?
I feel like I should start as a funder on the table. Look, I guess what I would say that it is in some ways a false dichotomy, because I think our ability to lean in on advocacy is informed directly and fully by our experience working with community partners involved in service. That's what drives an advocacy agenda. That's what gives us credibility when we speak to policymakers. So I don't think you can separate those two things. What I would say is that I think philanthropy is too conservative in its balance generally, in understanding that advocacy has to be a part of that agenda. That's the journey that Robin Hood is on ourselves. I mean, we over the last few years, our willingness to invest resources in advocacy and research is different than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
2 years from now, is it likely to be further down that same road, do you think?
I would think so. I would think so, but it is not to the exclusion of direct services, both because there are people today who need our services and our support, but also because it is, I'm looking around this room, the reason why people in this room are such effective advocates is because their advocacy is grounded in the experience of providing direct service at a high level, and demonstrating what works, not only with data, but with stories.
Thank you to Robin Hood for funding advocacy. I think of it like this for funders. If you want to stop the bleeding, fund direct services. If you want to prevent the injury, fund advocacy.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think, to Rich's point, the enabling conditions are what allow direct service to continue at high quality. And there are things that you see in the service space as a teacher, as a principal, as a district leader, that you're like, oh, we really need to fix that at the state level. And they work in tandem. It's not a binary.
And another question, let me toss out. Look, I think that in the folks here and those watching, there is probably enormous agreement on the importance of child allowances in the form of the refundable child tax credit, various early childhood interventions, baby job training. I mean, a bunch of those kind of standard interventions. We don't tend to talk as much about the ways in which many of the same constituencies have persevered in various structural inequity. You can't talk about poverty without talking about local school financing, which is a way to perpetuate disadvantage and lack of opportunity. And that issue of local school financing is one that's a hard conversation to have. Zoning regulations, single family zoning. Now, should we, if we're going to talk about child poverty reduction, should we have more of these conversations about local school financing, about zoning, that are going to make a lot of Robin Hood funders kind of uncomfortable, make a lot of my readers uncomfortable, or are they just are they third rails and it's just not worth going there? And I'm sure there are people watching who are kind of fidgeting nervously at that.
In a little bit of a pivot, I think one thing here in New York we should think about, and this is not specific to school funding, I'll leave that to my expert friends, but we expect counties to contribute to the costs of certain programs that help people living in poverty. And so what that means is the localities that have the most poor people have the most number of people who need Medicaid or other kinds of social services and the least ability to raise revenue. So I do think we should be thinking about how our state funds or doesn't fund our local districts, because we end up often impacting those local districts that are the poorest the most.
I think we have a really great example right now with the federal dollars that are sitting in our school districts across the state. New York State received, I think, $9.2 or $9.8 billion. $7.2 billion of that came to New York City. And what I can tell you is that feels like the proverbial lotto, right? Like if I won $1 million tomorrow, like it's all gonna look different, right? Like everything is gonna be different. But for our kids in returning after the pandemic, schools don't feel different, they don't sound different, they don't look different, but we're sitting on a boatload of cash. And so I'd argue that cash is only one piece of the puzzle, because right now in New York State, like half of our kids are not reading on grade level, period, full stop. And so we have to think about the role of literacy, particularly early literacy, the role of numeracy and our agileness and nimbleness in those things as real tools for kids very early, right? So money is a piece of it, but the way we're spending ARPA dollars, New York is like 49th in the country. The way we're spending that money is not the only issue. We've got capacity issues. We need better teacher prep. There's so many other pieces. And so to Rich's other point earlier, it's not the single bullet. There's no magic wand. It is literally the collaboration of folks like these in this room, thinking about where they're going to place their bet.
I mean, I would also just say that all of us, I say that with humility because it's true for all of us, including me, we all of us live with and accept at minimum, but actually benefit from the inequities of our world in a million ways. That's true very vividly when you think about something like the New York City public school system, which, to be fair, works very well for many children. It just doesn't work for all of our children. And so I think at the heart of that question at some level is our willingness to see other people's children of their own, our willingness to make sacrifices. And it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to look overseas. We can look within our own city and decide what type of inequality are we willing to continue to benefit from and stare at without being willing to make the kind of sacrifices and commitments to ensure that we have a city that works better for everyone. And I think the good news is that as we make those sacrifices, we will see this is not really a zero-sum game. Like better education for some actually can mean better opportunities for all. And that is at the heart of the political challenge, is that we naturally, as human beings, don't view the world that way. I can tell you every day my first decision-making is around my two children. That's what I prioritize in the daily decisions I make. our ability to move beyond that is what will ultimately lead us to have the city that we aspire to be.
We're going to turn into pumpkins shortly, but I'd like to just have sort of a final round, maybe starting with Sophie. I mean, one of the things we've talked about is that we do sort of know what to do. And how do we muster that political will? How do we provide that accountability over the next decade to take advantage of this opportunity I think we all believe we have? And, you know, as a writer, I've just got to say, I find it very frustrating that I can, especially when Trump is active, I could pretty much hit a, F5 key and turn out a column denouncing Trump, and it would get a lot of readers. And I could alternatively, go down to Louisiana or Mississippi and write about child poverty, and my readership would plummet by 80%. It is really hard to get engagement on these issues. And I think that's one of the reasons that, the refundable child tax credit was not extended. So any thoughts about just how we maintain this momentum, how we provide that accountability, how we take advantage of this, I think is an enormous opportunity in front of us. And Sophie, why don't we start with you and then come this way?
I think that momentum is still here. I'm just thinking about when the first CPSP briefs that were led by Chris or on the expanding the child allowance was in 2016. And at that time, it didn't seem like this was something that would happen in the 6 years later. I mean, 6 years later. And that just speaks that while it might not be what's happened or been continued, there's still momentum around this, and child poverty is being discussed across major news sources, media outlets. I mean, this topic is grown in focus, and I think it's continuing that push, as opposed to thinking of this as like maybe a step back, but it doesn't mean that that is not proceeding forward as a focal point of national policy.
I'd actually agree with Sophie and extend it a little bit. You'll see even just recent research around the student parent. For so long, we sort of ignored that a 17-year-old may also have a 3 or 4-year-old, or that a 21-year-old may have a child in kindergarten. We don't talk about the student parent enough, and there's been attention given to that. And I think it is because we're talking about child poverty. It is because we're talking about income and how student loans are impacting folks. So I think it's there. It's just in a lot of pieces.
So I want to just two things, call out that the Child Poverty Reduction Act passed with near unanimous, bipartisan, rural, urban, suburban, upstate, downstate support. So that's great. And as Sophie said, there's real talk about the child tax credit. And one thing we can do soon in the near is, kind of a child allowance packaged as a child tax credit by getting in those very young ones and making sure that the lowest income people can get the money. And we can actually start moving toward what looks like a child allowance.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. And again, I would just say, I think historically, I mean, I think, I would share your frustration. I share your frustration. At the same time, we are winning. We have victories every day. The conversation around a range of issues related to justice, from criminal justice to the rights of LGBTQ Americans to the rights of children, have moved appreciably over the last 50 years. And so I think for all the reasons to be pessimistic, there is just as many reasons to be optimistic, and there are things to learn from. I was at an event with Marion Wright Edelman a few months ago, and just thinking about her career and all the world that existed before the Children's Defense Fund and the world that exists now. Massive movement in the well-being of children around our country. So for all the pessimism, continuing to organize, to continue to lead, to hold elected officials accountable, to continue to tell stories as you do so well, I do think it actually works over time. And I think the error is that by by allowing the defeats to overwhelm us, that's ultimately where we give up our power.
Thank you for that excellent point. And we are, I'm afraid we don't have time. We're about to turn into pumpkins, but remember, you are the accountability mechanism of the next 10 years. And please join me in thanking our fantastic panel here.